Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 146 of the Revive Yourself podcast. Here we go.
Are you sick and tired of being sick and tired? Have you got a health issue that just won't go away no matter what you try? Then welcome to the Revive Yourself podcast, where we reveal the secrets to long-lasting health by getting to the root cause of problems that no one else is talking about. So you can have more energy, clear skin, healthier hair, a leaner physique, more confidence, and most importantly, do the things you love and live the life you deserve. Here's your host, Ryan Martin.
So guys, welcome back to the show, episode 146. Before we get going, just want to say thank you to those of you that have bought the book, The Chronic Fatigue Solution. They're getting some fantastic reviews. And people messaging me saying that they're getting lots from it, which is great. It's exactly what I wanted. If you haven't got it yet, then you can head over to www.thechronicfatiguesolution.com. We have actually had a few issues with delivery because the Royal Mail, unfortunately, misplaced a lot of our books, along with not just mine, there's two other authors as well. So the problem has been a bit of a pain in the bum. So if you are waiting on delivery, it's been a long time, let me know, or if you send me an email, then I can get onto our publishers and they can get it out to you. But the actual reviews of the book have been fantastic. And if you have been waiting a long time, give me a shout and we can sort something out. But thank you for your patience. It's just a few of the books went out, some didn't, and unfortunately it's one of those things. It's a real pain in my bum because my whole business is built on integrity and giving people exactly what they need. So to have people thinking that they haven't got their book, or that we're trying to take money off them without giving them product, is been a bit of a nightmare for myself. But I can assure you this isn't the case. The books will be on their way. And if you need, if it's been a bit of time, thank you for your patience. And if it's been over a couple of weeks, then please send me an email and we'll get it sorted for you. But if you haven't got your copy yet, then please do head on over to www.thechronicfatiguesolution.com and you'll be able to get the book there. We've also got the audio version, so that can be downloaded instantly. And you can listen to my lovely voice doing the audio version of that. If any of you have recorded an audio version of the book, you'll know how how fun that is. It's an experience, but it's one that you get better at, which is fun. But yeah, said before, if you haven't got it yet, www.thechronicfatiguesolution.com. Otherwise, if you're heading over to www.reviveyourself.co and click on the shop, we've got all of our products there that I recommend. And if you do buy them from us, it does help greatly because it allows me just to float the show, get great guests and spend more time on it. And we've got everything there that you want, from liver cleansers, milk thistle, to meal replacements in Living Fuel, the best all-round product on the market, greens drinks, sun creams, non-toxic sun creams, different products from different companies. All have a look there. Pearl powder if you're dealing with blemishes, that's from Ancient Purity. They've also got some great vitamin D and K2 and also vitamin C. We've got so many quality products we've got a gut bundle with the Finchley Clinic, and to restore products from them as well, from Dr. Zach Bush, which is going to really help impact building a healthy internal environment and clearing out your gut lining. That's the Restore product. If you haven't listened to my interview with Dr. Zach Bush, I definitely suggest you go back and listen to that. And so you've got a whole host of products. Evolution Organics, I said before, we've got our Ancient and Brave collagen and cacao, which is just a great product for mental clarity, for skin health, just for giving you a daily boost without caffeine. I'm never going to be a promoter of caffeine, having done extensive research in it, and it's something I always get my clients off. It's just one of the most heavily sprayed crops in the world. It's a central nervous system stimulant. It depletes from people's vitamin C. It's got a whole host of problems. It's heavily sprayed, as I mentioned. And so if you can get off that and instead have things like cacao, or any of the other healthy teas we've got there, from Palo d'Arco, Quadrupedra, Cat's Claw, they're all going to be fantastic for your health and boosting your immune system and giving you the energy and vitality. Anyway, that's it for that. On to today's show. We've got a guest, Michael Schrantz from Environmental Analytics, and we'll be talking all about your house, your internal environment of your house, and where people are getting, lots of people are getting exposed to mold and getting illnesses these days from having a toxic internal environment that they live in. So we'll be going into lots of different topics there, and Michael is a fun guy, very charming guy, and he's got an extensive knowledge. And as you'll see on this episode, we'll get into that. So without further ado, here's Michael. Enjoy, and I'll see you on the other side. Cold?
Actually, compared to Denver, we're actually pretty warm. We did have a cold front, but we're usually in terms of Fahrenheit, we're on the mornings it might be 40, 50 degrees. And then by the time it's in the middle of the day, we're low 70s. This is why we call them winter snowbirds. A lot of people from the colder country, retired people, that sort of thing, older folks, they actually have homes out here just because of the weather.
Yeah, here. I mean, also Arizona, it's Sedona always gets a great rep for people in like the health industry, and people love it. Yeah, Sedona, Arizona. Have you been there before?
Oh, yeah. That place is a postcard picture beautiful. It really is. Every time I went up there actually recently for a job, and it had been years prior to that, maybe 10 or 15. And when I went there, it was just like it was the first time again. The color of the rocks and the landscaping is so vividly different and non-dull. It's amazing.
What's it? Yeah, I really want to go there. I think everyone who's been there loves it. What, when you say vivid, what is it? Is it because of the environment, like the climate? Is that what makes it like so stand out?
I think it's probably ends up being the total package, but I guess specifically by vivid, I do mean the color contrast. Okay. In a desert, you're used to seeing duller colors. The greens are dull, the browns are dull colored. And even in green country, where there's a lot of trees or vegetation, I mean, those people are just used to kind of a certain theme. But Sedona is like its own beast. And like when you go online and you type in Sedona, Arizona, and you look at the pictures, they're not too far off from reality. There's just like a unique color in the rocks. And a lot of folks go up there for many reasons. There's a lot of folks who, with spiritual backgrounds. And so they kind of just go find themselves, or they go hiking, and there's so much to do up there. It's not a cheap town to live in. It's a great town to visit. Yeah. So it would be perfect if you ever wanted to head out here.
Yeah, no, everyone says that. It's a lot of people do have lots of retreats, spiritual retreats, and a lot of breathwork retreats and like plant medicine retreats there. And they say the sky is fantastic. I mean, when I've heard people describe like the sky and the stars, it reminds me. I've lived in New Zealand for 6 months, and the stars there were quite spectacular. So
I could see that can be in the relatable thing, and you absolutely. I mean, even the pollution is different in that area, so it totally makes sense. Yeah. Great comparison.
No, awesome. So that's definitely on my radar. So how far away from that are you?
Sedona for me, in terms of a drive, is probably, if I speed just a little bit, probably 4 hours. Maybe 4.5.
So it's still a fair slap. Well, for us, that's a fair slap. For you guys, 4 hours is nothing, right?
Yeah.
Fair enough.
I guess that depends. So.
Yeah, cool. So thank you for coming on. I know, like I've been looking into your work for a while. But I think the first time I heard you speak, I think, was on Extreme Health Radio. Have you been on that before?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yep.
Yeah, I think that was the first time I heard you speak, and then just been looking into everything. And to be fair, like in health, nutrition is always talked about a lot. Breath work now is talked about a lot. Meditation is talked about a lot. Even like the mind, the mental, emotional side of things is getting more talked about.
Right, DNRS, limbic system.
Yeah, all that. And the thing that sort of gets overlooked a little bit, in my opinion, is people's home environment. I recently had Brian Hoyer on here from Shielded Healing. He talks a lot about frequencies. He deals a lot about trying to stop like 5G in the home, Wi-Fi, people getting and like dowsing in the house. And I know that this is something as well. I mean, people sort of don't understand, or it seems to be like the last rock that gets lifted when it comes to their internal environment of their house. And I think it's something that people need to look into more, especially, they say office buildings as well, they're like 9 to 10 times more polluted than the air outside, and the air outside now isn't that great. So when you think about
Right.
it's something that people need to look into more, especially when they're dealing with health issues. So just
Right.
for people out there that haven't heard about yourself, Michael, and your company, etc., just give a little background into your journey into the space. You said into being an indoor environmental professional, and also your company that you've got now, and what led you to doing that?
Sure. Yeah, for me, although I didn't know that I would be here today, I started when I was 16 years old working for an air conditioning company, learning about, of all things, mechanical ventilation, fresh air coming into a building and all this. And of course, I didn't have a clue back then, but I was learning these fundamentals, airflow. Went through high school doing that, went through college, getting an operations degree in business, management, not necessarily in the work I do today, but still doing that work, and just found a real passion, high level, helping solve problems with people who had indoor complaints. Now, it may not have been chronic illness, but just phenomenons like ghosting or soot buildup on ceilings and people not knowing why that was happening, or if they did have a mold problem in their home, how to sample it. And I found myself feeling satisfied in the beginning as a younger man, learning about the ins and outs of this. And then what ended up happening, really what was the turning point in my career that got me to where I'm at today, is in 2006, I put together a business plan to go out and create my own company, environmental analytics. I opened the doors in 2007, and almost immediately I was doing the type of sampling that certain functional medicine doctors were starting to notice, especially here in town. And these are the doctors that were working with people who have chronic illness, whether the label is CIRS or Lyme or PANS or PANDAS or SIBO or Alzheimer's. I mean, the list goes on, right? And they had noticed that the type of sampling I was doing was picking up things that other traditional assessors were not picking up. And where there was a problem is where you saw the conflict. A clinician would say to the patient, "You're having exposure and you need to find it." They would hire a traditional assessor. They would come out, not find a problem, say there's not a problem. And of course, there's the conflict. And what I noticed was that I was really good at what I was doing. And what I also figured out was this is a really rewarding project. So I became really compassionate. I've always been a compassionate person, and very sympathetic to the people that you and I work with today, who are struggling to get better because they either are genetically susceptible. And I just found this such a rewarding job. I mean, I've had other opportunities that if the goal was to be financially better than where I'm at, I could have taken it. This has been just such a rewarding job that that's really how I got myself into where you see me at today. And now almost exclusively, I work with people who have chronic illness and issues around the globe.
I mean, to be honest with you, that's 99% of people. I mean, literally, you got, this is what people would say, "How's business?" to me. I'm like, well, everyone's ill, so it's not that I want everyone to be ill. And as you say, I'm extremely compassionate about it. And as when you get into it, it becomes your passion, right? Because you're like, you just want to spread the news and get people to understand that it doesn't have to be this way, but they have to know what they're looking for. And sometimes I've had people say to me at seminars before, "Well, I've done this and done this and done this. Why am I still ill?" I was like, "There's so many more rocks that you need to look under." And one of the questions I want to ask you is, why wouldn't the people that they employed initially to find whatever the functional medicine practitioners was looking for, why wouldn't they find it? And what were you doing differently that allowed you to find the issues that were there?
I've thought about that over many years because that question gets asked quite a few times. And really, I think it's a combination of two things. The biggest thing I've learned to say is critical thinking. I think that's what it boils down to. You used an analogy when we first started talking about there was this idea that contamination in homes can be up to 10 times, loosely, compared to higher in concentration compared to outdoors. Well, imagine going out there as an inspector, a traditional inspector, with that kind of background assumption that if it's less than 10 times, it may not be a problem. Right. So number one, they're already setting themselves up for failure because we're not dealing with traditional healthy population usually with those criteria. By the way, that criteria of 9 to 10 times is more usually chemical related, but people have used that for mold and other things. But that being said, the other part is that they don't even realize that there's other technologies that do more. So one example is anybody that's listening that's familiar with mold sampling understands that a very common practice for sampling mold uses a device or a method called spore trap sampling, where they collect air, they look for spores that might be floating around in an environment. It's not that that's a worthless test, but it might be worth less than more forensic sampling like qPCR, DNA testing, where it's not just looking for big fat mold spores, but it's looking for mold fragments. And if you do your research, you'll find that depending on the study, for every one mold spore, there's somewhere between 300 and 500 mold fragments in these examples, which indicates no matter how you cut the cards, there's way more fragments present in an environment than there are spores. Well, you have traditional inspectors, to answer your question, going out there sampling for spores. By the way, in a sedentary environment where gravity typically wins, and they don't pick up a problem. Well, we were sampling air and dust back when. And so we were picking up problems. It might have been indirect measurements like collecting history on the surface as well, but indicating that no, there is an exposure, and that was a surrogate. What do I mean by surrogate? Well, just because we did find something, it could also indicate that there's other things present. You said maybe there's more rocks that need to be unturned. Well, there could be other things floating around that this method wasn't able to pick up. So I think going back to the question, it was a combination of using critical thinking, understanding that we don't need to follow some basic measure of 10 times or greater that somehow justifies somebody's having an exposure or not, which is absolutely a bad way of looking at it, and also understanding the limitations of the sample that you're doing in the first place.
Yeah, 100%. Well, that's why someone would come to you, right? Because it's having not just having the tools, but actually knowing what to look for, knowing that. So I get a lot of times that people come to me and say, well, Ryan, I had this test done, and it didn't show up any, for example, parasites. And I was like, well, first of all, the tests that you're having, a lot of them give false negatives or false positives, and that's not the test that we want to be doing. There's a lot of other things we want to be doing, because the traditional testing, if for certain things in what I do, it doesn't show up everything. It's not comprehensive enough. And so, I'm guessing that it's like almost to put it into, it's like Ghostbusters. You go to them because they're the experts at getting the ghosts. I know it might sound a little crass, a little ridiculous, but it is what it is. If you know what you're looking for as well, or if you haven't had your mind open, you said there, spores very different to fragments. So for someone looking at a house of mold, for example, because you do a lot of molds and funguses that we want to get into.
Sure, certainly a big thing, yeah.
Big thing. So if someone was looking at a spore compared to like a fragment, would a spore be like, just for people out there, because obviously we're doing this in audio, if you're looking, it would be something they can actually see in the corner, like quite a lot of mold, black, compared to a fragment, they wouldn't be able to see it. Would that be something airborne?
Yeah. Well, fragment can be anything. When I say, and it's a fair question. When I say fragment, it can be any part of the mold structure, whether it's a spore, a hyphal fragment, the conidiophore, any part of the actual structure. A lot of people talk about mold in terms of, they use an example that kind of looks like a tree.
Yeah.
But to put this in perspective, because people aren't we're just doing audio, on average, 250 mold spores can fit on the top of a needle pinhead, the kind that you sew with, side by side without falling over. So just as a general, macro appreciation, that's a lot. I mean, those are small. You can't even see the spores. When people see mold, they typically are seeing colonies of growth, not just like one spore. And so then imagine for every one of those spores, there's 300 to 500 fragments. I mean, it's crazy. So a lot of that stuff can settle out. It can become airborne. But more importantly, if you're not thinking about it, critical thinking, or you're not using a type of testing that can detect it, you might come back with results that indicate there's not a quote unquote exposure. And where that becomes a real issue, a real sticking point, is when you're working with a clinician or some sort of a practitioner that's working with your health who's suggesting there is an exposure. Oh, and by the way, you're not recovering as a result of it. So that's where a lot of our industries, the clinicians and the IEPs have clashed, because we're realizing that the further we go down this rabbit hole and try to understand chronic illness. I love your analogy with Ghostbusters. It's right on, because it's really new frontier. The Ghostbusters, they started to do something. They were still learning. They're still students, but they did figure something out. And that's really where the truth of the matter is. That's where chronic illness diagnosis and treatment and even environmental sampling is at. This is new frontier. And it's very scary for patients to hear that, because I don't know about you, Ryan, but I grew up where you went to the doctor's office. If you had a problem, they would do some measurements. They would give a test code and say, okay, based off of this, you need to take this prescription and then come back in a week and you'll be better. That was how complicated it got. It was that simple. Now it's like, you ask 10 experts their opinion of what your illness even is, and you get 15 different responses. So going back to the issue, fragments are really small. They're just a piece of the pie, but mold is natural and organic and decays just like we do over time. The real question is that fragment, is that spore causing an exposure? And if it's not something that's pathogenic, is it something that's causing an inflammatory response to your body, which is a lot of things that a lot of chronic illness, CIRS, Lyme, that sort of thing, that's what they're looking at, is the inflammatory effects of any exposure to whatever the contaminant may be, not just mold.
Yeah, 100%. This is, I mean, unfortunately, until I was about 16, that was what doctors did for me. Went there, gave me a pill, and then unfortunately I went through a lot. That's why I do what I do now, because it didn't work. And so it was like 5 years of trying to figure out what was going on. But as you said, has got like that, because I suppose they're getting more, well, especially functional doctors and practitioners are getting more aware of different things. But as you said, it's the reason people are reacting or not knowing what you said, we mentioned all the different things there, Lyme, mold exposure, etc. Because people's immune systems are constantly lowered, because they're exposed to more, water that isn't as healthy as it was before, food supply that's not as sprayed, pesticides, herbicides, rodenticides, chemical fertilizers, fungicides, because they're constantly stressed about money, or their relationships breaking down, or they've got Wi-Fi on all day and at night, so their lymphatic system can't clear out. You keep on going into these things, and they're having pasteurized, homogenized dairy, and It means that their immune system's always, they're always in their fight and flight, rather than, they're in their sympathetic rather than their parasympathetic nervous system. So they're more likely to have a reaction to these things because they're constantly stressed. The immune system's lowered, so these things can, where normally the body could be like, okay, we can live in conjunction with this, because bacteria and parasites and pathogens and fungi been around. As you said, mold been around as long as we have, right? But we had stronger immune systems probably because we weren't dealing. I know we're the most advanced we've ever been. We're fatter and sicker than ever. So it's quite interesting to see, because a lot of people are getting these mysterious illnesses and they don't know why. And I was like, well, in my opinion, this is just I'll ask you this question, Michael, because just we'll see if this is somewhere around it. They're having these reactions to different things because obviously wherever their weakness is, that's what gets exposed. But because they're so stressed and they've got all these things going on, it brings their immune system down, weakens their constitution, and then you've got this, and it's probably like a cascade of a waterfall, and that could be the thing that just pushes them over the edge.
Yep.
You agree?
Yeah, I would have no argument. It's kind of like kicking a leg underneath a table. 4 legs is pretty stable. You remove one leg, how stable is that table? I think that, not just to that I agree, but I think the general consensus is that what you're saying is accurate. You mentioned so many different types of exposure, whether it was EMF, even dieting, the limbic system, PTSD, and how that may play a role, whether it's 1% or 50% of someone's problem. And then, of course, the defined illness itself. I think the challenge we all are having, and I think we're all, folks like you and me are open to it, but some people aren't, is we really don't know how to quantify it as easily. Mm-hmm. We can qualify it. We can say EMF is a potential exposure, and we can use certain examples to prove that it's an exposure. But how can we quantify the net of it, the soup of it, if you will, in a particular home? That has been one of the biggest challenges for me.
Yeah, it's hard because it's hard to know. It's the same as someone can walk into a hotel in Vegas, for example, and people are taking them for millions of pounds because they go there, they can't sleep. They come out in skin rashes, and it's not because they've had loads of cocaine and drunk loads. It's because the fragrances that have been pumped through the hotel and other things they put in the air to keep people awake have completely destroyed them. But some people can go in a Vegas hotel for months on end and be absolutely fine. So it is hard to see what is going on. So the best thing, obviously, if you can't measure exactly, like I wish we could have a chart and be like, well, my Wi-Fi exposure is actually tolerance is quite up here, and my organic food tolerance and pesticides is down here. It'd be quite good. Unfortunately, we haven't got that quite yet.
Oh, yeah.
Sure, someone will come out of it soon. But in your opinion, because like you deal with a lot of these households, what's the thing that you see most as an issue in these households, and getting rid of these things for a lot of people would, at least it takes it out of the equation.
Yeah, I know, and I know I know it'll be a subjective response, but I'll give you my opinion, of course. Sure. I think the whole concept of damp buildings or water damaged buildings is still up there. We have homes that are basically boxes. We all live in them, and these boxes allow concentrations of any contaminant to build up. Now, I hate the word contaminant, by the way, just for the record, because it implies to some people that you're talking about radiation. Really, what I'm referring to is anything in the room or the building that your body would react adversely to. So when I go out to homes, and I've been in thousands of them, and I've consulted with thousands more over the years, what I see is dampness is really the main issue. And you might say, well, then what becomes of the dampness? Is it the dampness itself? Well, no, I think really it's what comes of it. So if it's microbial growth, whether it's mold or bacteria, right? And that now you're in a confined space, your home, you're not outside, and these things are amplifying and providing more exposure, higher concentrations. But it's not just the biological growth. Even chemicals, we see off-gassing rates increase. There's studies that show that obviously if you have dampness in a room, or if something gets wet, it interacts chemically with a certain ingredient in a building product, and it off-gasses. So that's an issue. And then I think the other two things that I would say are right up in there. So this whole high level of damp buildings, water damage, and the microbial chemical production that ensues because of it. The other two things, number one is just dirty living. People that have reservoirs, carpeting, they never clean the home, and that's seemingly such an issue. We see this: people clean their house, they kick up a bunch of dust while they're doing it, and that soup of that dust, what it represents is an exposure, an inflammatory exposure, and then EMF. I think EMF is on the rise. I'm not as I consider myself definitely more of a student when we talk about EMF. I kind of know enough to be dangerous, if you will. But I get the concept. I mean, it wasn't but 100 years ago where the level of EMF exposure was a small fraction, and now we're being surprised that people are reacting when they when they even hold their cell phones, or they put it up to their head. And then you have all this 4G and 5G talk, and it's not natural. We haven't caught up with the evolution of that exposure, that's a whole other topic. But this whole thing of we're throwing more and more stuff into our pathways. Maybe it's a Wi-Fi router in our homes, and we're being surprised that we're feeling crappy right next to it. And that is I want to end on this point. I actually had that happen to me personally, where I bought a Wi-Fi router a couple years ago, and it was one of these super duper ones. I went to a known box store, and I said, "Give me the best, give me the most powerful," because I'm in a brick home and I wanted good reception. And
so American
I do podcasting. Oh yes, right. Give me the best, and so they did that. And what had happened is I stuck that about 5 feet linear from my what was technically my body, my head, and I seemed to notice like that whole week I felt really crappy, and my particular symptom was I felt down, depressed, and that's not me. Normally I'm upbeat. So I had, like I told you, I know enough to be dangerous. So I kind of wondered about that. I was already kind of aware of that. I ended up changing it to a different unit that was way less powerful. I put even a Faraday cage over my unit, and I'm thinking, okay, do I need to put a tinfoil over my head? But I was trying to be open-minded to this newer thing that's developing in our industry of talk. Problems went away. No issues. Didn't have the depression. So, what does that mean? Does that mean that that's a conclusive study? This is the problem: is we don't have 30 years of like double-blinded. It is for me. N equals 1, and that was all I needed. Yeah,
but that in my world, that's all that matters. Is in, I get what you're saying, bigger picture, and we're not putting things out there for other people. But I always say to people, you're a study of one. I don't care what someone's written in the research paper. If someone says look, eating prawns is phenomenal for you. You eat a prawn and you feel terrible. Your body's telling you everything you need to know. And even if it's a placebo, I don't care. Placebo is phenomenal. I'd rather people, that's great, take it away, you feel better. Who cares? Results are all that matter, right?
Right. Well, in your defense, I might just say that because chronic illness is such a hard thing to track, and because we're so unique, we're all unique species, and we all have genetic differences that makes us unique and beautiful, we end up playing the reduction game. And what I mean by that is I kind of refer to a lot of things like an equation, and you have variables, and your life is not X plus Y equals Z, right? Your life is X plus 99 other variables equals you. And so if you can remove one of the variables, for example, EMF exposure, and you get better, I mean, that's to your point. It worked for you. And I think where the real issue is, probably those listening right now would agree to this approach. Where it becomes a sticking point and troubling is when the reduction is cost prohibitive, or there's other stresses, maybe a spouse that doesn't agree with you, and that ends up being a lot of what I help people guide through. Is I try to provide an objective, as much as an objective scientific weight that I can to a particular concern, a particular incident in the home, and help guide people to saying, well, does it seem reasonable? Or you don't have to throw everything out, but maybe you can store it in these bins and get them out of your living spaces, and then see how you feel and track your progress. And it's very much a step-by-step progress, because to the other point of this, if you just simply threw everything out and lived in a tent outside, a lot of people can't do that. There are a lot of people listening that may know somebody, or they are themselves that are doing it, but that's not reasonable or realistic for most people, especially those who have family members like young children.
Yeah, 100%. I talk about what you just said there is one the lines quote that I heard from. Do you know who Dr. Thomas Levy is?
Don't know if I'm familiar with that one.
He's an expert on vitamin C. He's got great, and one of his mentors said to him, like, you can't dry off when you're still in the shower. So it's sort of like trying to limit as much. Yeah, trying to limit as much. And it's always stuck with me, because I always say that. Try and limit your exposure as much as possible. And I know people can't live in tents, and look, at the end of the day, we're modern men in a modern world. But we can reduce stuff, and turn your Wi-Fi off at night is great. And everyone's got a toxic threshold, and everyone's different. And so, yeah, I completely understand where you come from. In fact, do you know who Dr. Deborah Davis is, Michael?
Yeah, my problem is I work with so many, but I don't want to say I do.
Okay.
What's the background on that, doctor?
Okay, no, Dr. Deborah Davis, she's like one of the world's leading authorities on EMF. And I always say to people, if you haven't, if people were like, on the fence or think it's a conspiracy, I always say go and listen to some of her lectures. Yep. The lady's got more letters behind her name than the alphabet, and so she's a proper scientist. And also Nick Penalt's got the non-tinfoil hat guy to EMF. You know Nick, yeah. So
I know him. Yep.
Yeah. So I always say to people, like, just go and do your own research and listen to them speak, and I'm not, just take what you will. These are independent studies done, and so when it comes to things like that, I think there's enough research out now to at least suggest people. Not everyone, but a lot of people can be negatively exposed, or even people that aren't symptomatic or asymptomatic, or haven't got acute issues because of it. You don't know how much that's lowering their threshold. So, it's an interesting conversation. What I'd want to ask you about that is: have you noticed since EMF exposure has gone up and Wi-Fi has gone up? Have you noticed anything with the mold colonies? Have they grown because of this?
You're referring to some studies that are coming from a certain doctor who's claimed through some research that EMF has caused molds to amplify or grow. I haven't been able to see an observation that would quantify it, meaning, I'll give just maybe one basic example where you walk into a room and maybe the room had water damage and mold growth, and it's also loaded with electronic equipment and that sort of thing, that would show differently than say another room that's the opposite of that with water damage. I think that I think it's potential. If that's really where the question is leading, is does EMF complicate other things like microbial growth in the form of amplifying it? I certainly can't argue that it can't. I think you have to dive into the details and say, well, is it because EMF is a stressor that mold is growing, but the mold still needs still needs moisture to grow. What is the environment that makes it conducive or not? So my radar's been up. I've heard about that, but I haven't personally seen an area where I can go, this just seems so abnormal for the leak to represent the mold or the bacteria growth that we're actually seeing. In other words, I don't see an alien version of what we would otherwise normally see. If there's water damage and it's been there long enough, typically the microbial growth that you see is consistent with where that dampness or water damage has occurred. The fact that it may have grown more or less because of EMF exposure, I think that's a great question that needs to be looked into further.
Yeah, I actually hadn't read those studies. That was just my brain asking questions, which I've always. I was just thinking, viruses, pathogens, bacteria, these things. When they're stressed or they feel that they're being attacked, they generally, they can proliferate and they can adapt and change and maybe get stronger, like antibiotics, do.
Sure.
So I was just wondering if you've seen that, especially. But yeah, no, I'm sure you're in the trenches. So if it does happen, you'll probably be aware of it more than anyone. So,
or at least hear about it. And that's the thing is I think the takeaway though, it's a great question, and I think certainly from a scientific standpoint, if there was the ability to do an independent study, controlled, all that good stuff. But, at the end of the day, it still boils down to how would we address it differently?
Yeah.
It's in other words, even if EMF didn't affect growth in a bad way, meaning it was creating, it wasn't creating, how do I say this? It wasn't creating new strains of mold, or it wasn't creating more mold than what would otherwise grow. It's not like you and I would say, well, you know what? Then go ahead and leave that big high-powered Wi-Fi router alone. We're still going to say the things that we do because we understand that everyone is unique. And there's not a formula that is specific, a guide, if you will, that says, oh, well, we've looked at Mrs. Smith's blood or urine analysis, and it came back X, Y, and Z, and based off of that, she can be exposed to these exact quantities. Maybe we'll be there in the space age, another 100,000 years, but we're not there today, so we end up making more holistic recommendations, which are things like reduce your EMF emissions, keep your house dry, remediate these sources, and so on and so on.
Yeah, so that's actually that's what I always say, that holistic approach. If you're doing lots of that stuff, it's gonna pay dividends in the end. It's gonna boost you, and even if it takes. Sometimes people, they say, "Oh, how quickly will I get better?" It's like, well, how long's a piece of string? It's quite a loaded question, and unfortunately, the answer, like you said, subjective. It always depends, and anyone who's an expert in any of their criteria, that's probably their answer for a lot of questions, because it does depend on you. You are individual, and unfortunately, we're not robots. It's not just plug and play. It depends how quickly.
No, and it's frustrating for everyone. It's it's frustrating for the patients that are in the trenches dealing with the illness to hear that. And many tears have been shed between me and clients over the years, because they're really the example I use, just to sympathize for 30 seconds with those listening who might be experiencing illness and looking for understanding, is that it's kind of like you're swimming in the ocean or treading water in the ocean, and it's dark. You can't see land. You don't know how deep the water is, and you don't know how many sharks or whatever fish that scares you is floating around you. And you're looking for comfort. You're looking for something to float on. You're looking for land, and you don't know where it's at. You don't even know up from down after a while. And I think that's the scariest part, is that there's a lot of folks out there that feel that way. And when I've explained it in that manner, they connect a lot. And so it's overwhelming, but the good news is that you have folks like myself, folks like Ryan, and other people that are out there that they're not going to be able to solve world peace for you. But if you have 100 questions and we're able to answer 80% of them, you might feel like you won the lottery that day, because you're heading in the right direction on your road to recovery. And so we hear you. It's complicated and it's frustrating, and we don't want it to be frustrating. I'm sure there'll be a day where maybe we can offer a solution. You just click this button and it'll solve everything, but we're not there yet, and we want to be there.
For those people, and 100%, I've dealt with people with that mold in the house, and it's hard because their bodies, but said before, it's always in a stress state, so it won't even get down to the level where the parasympathetic can kick in, and so it's hard to heal. But and for those people, I'm good. Because we'll go on to other things. I want to go into symptoms, preventions, and stuff, as you mentioned a little bit before. But for those people, like, at what point does it get to what point does it get where someone has to move house? Like,
yeah, that string example and the word "it depends" is very applicable here. It's a case by case situation, but I can give you kind of a somewhat of an answer. I think it boils down to how much money and time they're willing to spend. and it's not from the standpoint of a maximum. It's, can we say step one is do X, and X depends on do we need to remediate something? Do we need to improve something? Do we need to clean something? And then maybe step two is they go visit their clinician and they look at clinically, is there improvement? Or is there enough indication of improvement that they can keep things as is in the home? And if the answer to that question is no at that point, then step three is, well, what can I do further? And you start looking at, well, are there other sources in the home, right? And if the answer to that is, well, no, we don't necessarily have any other sources in the home, but maybe we can do things like get rid of reservoirs like carpeting, or we can do better air filtration, or mechanical ventilation where we're bringing in fresh air from the outside. And that would be a big step three. And eventually the client says, yeah, here's the problem with that, Mike. I'm not willing to spend that money. I'd rather sell my home and start new because, there's a whole host of reasons why. That's the breaking point to answer your question for that individual. The next person may say, yeah, I'm willing to go step three and see how that works. And if that doesn't work, then I'll move out. So there's no black and white. And that's not quite true. I've had one home where it was so bad, it just seemed like a bulldozer would have been the best option at that point to start over. But most homes, I think, are recoverable. It's just an issue of how extently they need to be fixed. Right. And yes, I'm sure you've seen some really bad ones, but sometimes they're not that bad. It's just, do you have the money for it?
Yeah. It was more to the point of, is it worth them sitting through that and trying to sort out their house rather than just moving into an environment which hasn't got that? Do you know what I mean? Even if it means
let's engage that. Let's engage that, because that's a wonderful topic, and I think it's deserving. So what are they walking into? Is this a question of they're jumping from the frying pan into the fire? If they're going to rent a new place, what if it's worse than the place they just went from that they own? The problem is, and again, this is why there's really no cookie cutter solution for everybody, because everyone has a unique set of circumstances, whether it's logistical issues, financial issues, and spousal issues. But obviously, one of the other challenges is, what is the criteria beyond money to determine whether or not that environment's good enough? I worked with a client yesterday where she acknowledges that she's getting better, but she still has symptoms. And the $1 million question was, well, is that good enough for you then, that you'll actually continue to get better because you're doing treatment with this clinician in your area, and that in another few months your symptoms are going to disappear, but yet you didn't do anything to the home. It's good enough for you to get better. So it's a very subjective question, because if the client tells you, Mike, my criteria for me to live in this home is I want to have no symptoms, but they're dealing with mast cell activation syndrome or MCS or having PTSD issues, or they're just highly symptomatic, that may not be a realistic goal, period. Now, I'm saying that subjectively. I'm not a clinician, but I don't know that on a Monday they can be in a bad home and then they can rent a home on a Tuesday and everything's going to go away. So it's a loaded question, and my advice for those people listening is that you need to work with a professional, which would be an environmental professional and also your clinician, to guide you through some sort of a 2 or 3 or 4 step program that may take months for you to figure out. And for a vast majority of people, they're willing to do that. And for a vast majority of people I've worked with, that's been the solution. They try things and then they'll get to a financial cutoff point and say, okay, that's it. We're done. We're going to start new and take the chance.
Yeah, makes sense. It does make sense, and it's I'd say the most logical way of doing things, really. Seeing how you can get, because let's be honest, most people don't want to overhaul their life. It becomes another stress, and so that can put them back. So you mentioned a couple of terms there. Just for people out there, carpeting. What does that mean?
Oh, carpeting, like a carpeted area, right, versus hard flooring. So the overall concern there is that if you have carpeting or rugs, you have the potential for dust to build up and whatever else is inside of that dust. And historically, it's kind of a harder surface to clean and maintain. And when you take a particle counter, for example, in a home with carpeting, in my experience, typically the counts compared to outsides will be a higher percentage than the same type of home with hard flooring. And so, but if it costs you $15,000 or 15,000 pounds to replace your carpeting with a hard flooring alternative, you might say, Mike, I don't have the money for that. So that was just one high level thing that we talk about with certain clients who have carpeting or rugs. Is there something you can do to reduce the buildup of contaminants in the home? It's not necessarily the source of them, but it's a place where they can build up.
Yeah, they can build. So I wanted to go into that because most people don't realize just how toxic carpet is. Even in its own, like, it can be off-gassing.
Oh, sure. Right,
it can be like hugely off-gassing. And I think they did a study and it said like a child playing on a carpet is the same as him having 5 cigarettes after like 6 hours.
Wow.
And it was just because now you've got flame retardants, volatile VOCs, and there's so many things on organic compounds, as well as the molds, funguses that can build up, and especially people got pets that have been outside. The pet goes on the carpet, anything goes in, and then the wet or whatever else. And I always say to people, you can't see my floor here, hardwood throughout. I was just like hardwood or tiles, because at least you can pick it up with a Hoover. And carpets, it's unless now people got fancy rugs and stuff. It's fair enough, but it's just if the majority of your house is carpeted, it's just like allergies, and not even if you've got molds and yeast, but this got allergies and stuff. These things can build up.
Oh yeah, no, right on. And the angle that you were coming from is even the carpeting itself, maybe not from a biologic standpoint, other than just a reservoir. But yeah, you're right. The off-gassing of the glues and adhesives, especially used underneath carpeting, has always been a concern. And you go back into this idea of you live in a confined space, and so these products off-gas, and there's a higher than normal concentration. Yeah, absolutely. Really tough to know though, right? Because the problem is that the general industry for building homes or even remodeling homes hasn't really caught up or willing to spend the money or willing to accept the importance of using these types of products that we're getting at that might be a safer alternative. So it's a real struggle for the people out there, but when they can do it, we recommend some resources and things like that can help them find better products than what they may currently have in their home.
No, awesome. I mean, I'll be honest, Michael, I've been doing this for a long time now, but I only got into it because I was ill. So most people don't get into it because they got strong constitutions, or well, at least they did have. Not more people now are getting this way because there's so much impacting them, or so much. But generally, people, when they get like these sort of issues, they're like, oh, okay. What I said, once again, get out of. You can't draw off if you're not when you're in the shower. So one thing I can do is, if I can do it, or if I'm going into a new home, or if I can decorate my new place, you know what? If I'm thinking of getting a carpet or hardwood, I'd just go hardwood, and it looks better, in my opinion, anyway.
Yeah. Well, but your point, your example there is actually perfect, because sometimes there's opportunities. Yeah. And when we work with clients, it's like, oh, well, you were planning on remodeling this area anyway. Well, hey, let's kill two birds with one stone, if you excuse the expression, and do that alternative flooring, because you already were going to redo this area anyway. So this is the point. It's so customized that we just don't have a cheat sheet for people. I mean, we can give you hard overlying things that we want you to do, but then people are still left with, how do I apply these? How do I weight these, order them in my own home? That's been always the challenge.
So for people out there, because prevention, well, we're going to get into it. In fact, before we get into that, new homes, in any home, how quickly can mold develop if you've got a brand new home? I mean, does it matter? I mean, how long do you have to be doing things wrong? Or is it like having the windows open and condensation coming in, or when you're having a shower, these things and mold can build? Like, how long do you have to be doing things wrong for it to build?
Yeah, no, I think so. We'll start with the word. It depends. Yeah. But then I think there's best case, worst case, right? Yeah. So, or maybe we could say fastest versus slowest. Some of the studies that have been out for a while, and it's funny because a lot of the ones I've referenced actually come from the food industry, because mold has a big influence in that industry. Shows that when culturing under ideal conditions, that you might have mold colonize and visually see it within, say, 24 to 48 hours, as a general rule of thumb. But these are more perfect conditions, ideal environments, ideal moisture, ideal nutrients for it to grow in. There are other molds where they've shown that it has taken literally weeks and months, many weeks to 3 or 4 months to grow, where they're very slow growing. Think about maybe mold that might grow in a crawl space under a home. There might be fast growers, of course, in there, but there could be molds that there's just enough moisture that's not ideal for it, but it will technically grow at an incredibly slow, weeks or months rate. And over many years, because you've been doing it wrong, to use your example, it has colonized and became an issue over many years. So that's depends.
A dangerous one.
24 to 40.
The slow creeper could be a dangerous one you don't see.
Well, or just one that you discount because beyond the fact that it creeps and maybe takes a really long time to grow, maybe some of the environments that might happen in, and this certainly isn't meant to be an exhaustive or all-encompassing example, but take a crawl space. They're very common in the States in certain areas, and you have areas where people look at a crawl space and they're like, yeah, but it's a crawl space. It's not an operating room. I'm not going to eat in there. I'm not going to perform heart surgery in there. And, heck, we have water in the wintertime that pools up underneath there. And we're sitting here going, yeah, but that's the perfect environment for there to be a microbial source. And there's definitely pathways between your crawl space and your subfloor that's right above it for these things to eventually get into the home. So, yes, I don't think that we can be prejudiced and say that there's more or less concern with slow growers versus fast growers. I think we need to be aware of all of it and just ask the question, we're not looking for mold free in your home. We're looking for your house to reflect the term I like to use, and I know it's something that has been referenced in a standard that we have out here for called the S520, but normal fungal ecology. So right now, everyone that's listening to this, you're breathing and inhaling mold spores, mold fragments, mycotoxins, bacteria from the outside. It has nothing to do with the source in your home, and there's very little you can do to certainly eliminate that. That's called normal fungal ecology for the purposes of our conversation. We're really trying to look at whether it's a slow grower or a fast grower. Does your environment look like normal fungal ecology, or is there a potential source? And if there is, how do we remediate it or prevent it happening in the future?
Yeah, awesome. And just for people out there, you said crawl space, yeah?
Yeah, right. The space underneath homes, some homes have like a pier and beam construction where they're technically risen up off the ground so that you can run plumbing or electrical lines or ductwork. I don't know how common that is out in your area, though I know some homes places have slight, like minor versions. You wouldn't even be able to crawl underneath it, but technically a gap between the floor and the soil. But that's what we're talking about here.
Yeah. I just wanted because I think it's more common in the States and Canada, especially in areas where they get water quite a lot. In some of your houses in certain places, they get. But we do have it in here in some places. But it was just for a lot of people listening, they might be like, what's cool space?
Well, even an attic space then. I mean, go the other direction. It might not be as bad, but if you're living in a damp climate with inadequate ventilation or the potential for the attic to condense with moisture because you have hot air meeting a cool surface and yada yada yada, this is the same issue of how do we address that space that technically isn't a living space. When I'm referring to crawl or attic, I'm talking about a non-conditioned space. You don't live there.
Yep.
You don't go up there. Maybe at most you store your luggage or your seasonal stuff, but that's it. How do we address those environments? They're definitely areas of concern.
Yeah, awesome. And so for people out there, because prevention, obviously, when things come, I want to get into that. So before we get into cure, prevention. What can people do to stop these things happening? Because, I mean, I was going to ask you about the symptoms that people get from these things, but the list is so comprehensive, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
It's
like looking up the word headache online and seeing the results. I mean, I think it's more about looking at the cluster of symptoms and working with the clinician who's familiar. Mm-hmm. More qualified certainly than I am to say this is indicating a microbial exposure or not.
It's the same as anyone presents with parasitic or fungal problems. The list are so extensive. Everything from brain fog to abdominal cramps.
That's a big one.
Yeah. Brain fog's a huge one. Yeah, skin issues, poor energy. Not being able to sleep. Not being able to sleep, sensitivity to fragrance. There's so many things you can go into. And just not feeling yourself. That's one. Just feeling as you said. You're usually happy-go-lucky or energetic, and you were feeling down, a bit depressed. These things they can really take over. And when they embed, if you don't do things to stop your exposure and to actually work on yourself, they can. Their Mother Nature's decomposers. They can really go to town. So, what are things that people can do to prevent this happening?
Yeah, I think if we're talking about, it helps to categorize. If we're talking about microbial growth, the number one thing is keep the place dry. Mold's not going to grow if it doesn't have enough moisture. And obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, there's different species of mold and bacteria and other things that require a certain minimum amount of moisture, if you will, to grow, or available water activity on a surface to grow. The takeaway here is to keep it dry. Of course, that's a book in of itself. I mean, if it's keep the house dry in the inside of the home, it might be using a dehumidifier. If it's a crawl space or an attic, it might be a combination of, can we put some sort of a dehumidifier in there and or proper ventilation? And a lot of times that is limited by even the code requirements and working with a local contractor to say, what are my options here if your overall goal is to minimize condensation? If you're talking about taking a shower, it's having an exhaust fan to lower the duration of elevated moisture in that room so that you don't have as many black spots or any sort of mold or bacteria growing on the ceiling of your shower. But then again, that's also a tough place to maintain. It's like being surprised to find bacteria in a toilet bowl. You're going to have it in there. It's more like minimizing it and managing that moisture level in the bathroom. Beyond keeping the place dry, there's really not, for prevention purposes of mold growing, there's not much you can do. And I only say that because of the following reason. There's nutrients everywhere. People say, like mold can grow on glass. And you might say, well, how does it grow on glass? Well, it's not eating or degrading the glass. It's degrading or eating the debris, the nutrients that settled on the glass. And so we're bombarded, we're surrounded by nutrients, some more rich than others, and ideal than others, like cellulose drywall, for example, is a lot better for mold to grow and amplify than plaster, because the pH level in plaster isn't as conducive for microbial growth. And there's always going to be a viable mold spore or structure that can grow. So you can't really control the viable mold or microbial that is able to grow and amplify, because it's part of our ecosystem. Without it, we ironically wouldn't be here. It's a balance. We're trying to be in harmony with nature, and we've done a poor job as human species in general doing that. And you really can't control nutrients because they're abundant. So keeping the house dry for microbial growth is key.
Yeah.
It's easier when we talk about other things like EMF. Well, it's like reduce exposure, and sometimes it's turn off the router at night or whatnot, or it's hardwire your lines in the home. Things that are higher level. You can't really move a cell phone tower that's it's parked 100 meters away from your house. So you have to ask yourself, do I need to do some high level testing or buy some meters myself? Which there's great people like the gentleman that you mentioned earlier. There's people like Brandon LaGracca. There's people like Jeremy Johnson out of San Francisco Bay Area who offer relatively free resources to have you do high level testing yourself. If you're talking about chemicals, well, then it's an issue of saying, well, prevent bringing in things that are off-gassing. And you may raise your hand at an audience member and say, well, it's too late. I moved into this home and it already had it. What do I do? Well, then it just ends up being a case-by-case situation. If your cabinets are off-gassing formaldehyde or some other sort of chemical, you're probably not going to rip your cabinets off because it's probably too expensive. So you want to rip them out, you want to replace them, but if cost is an issue, you may look at other solutions. And sometimes encapsulation of those cabinets is a solution, sometimes dilution with fresh air is a solution. There are a lot of high-level things people can do to reduce it, but ultimately working with a professional to prioritize those, I think, is where these people that are in need to start, so that they're not wasting their time and money.
100%. And what you said there about dilution with air, best solution for pollution is dilution, one of those things. So air, having fresh air coming in, as you mentioned before, like maybe an air humidifier or a dehumidifier if you've got in some wet or damp coming into the windows. You get air filters.
Like that. So
air filters.
You're bringing in fresh air from the outside. So besides the concerns we have, besides the concerns that we inherently have with climates, bringing in fresh air from the outside, the whole idea is that you're trying to dilute contaminants that you're otherwise unable to remove through traditional mechanisms like cleaning the house or air filtration.
I was going to say plants might be a good one.
Okay, yeah.
But is that something that is that a filtration system that you guys use?
Well, actually, ironically enough, in my own home, I have a system that's very similar to this, where it does exactly what it showed in that picture. I think I took it off screen for you a second ago, but just the idea that it brings in air from the outside and it actually exchanges it with stale air from the outside.
Very good.
So on the face of it, you're lowering particles. Here's the real challenge, and it happens all the time, especially in your parts and any other humid climate, is you're worried about bringing in moisture-laden air from the outside and potentially causing a secondary issue, which is the production of microbial growth, maybe in the ductwork itself, depending on how it's designed, or other factors. So there's a lot of moving parts of how do we even condition the air that's coming from the outside first before we introduce it into our home so that we don't create a secondary issue. But yes, traditionally with chemicals, going back to the original question, dilution ends up being a solution for lowering concentrations of chemicals when you can't remove the source.
So that air filtration system you just showed us, that will affect the air coming in as well.
It will bring in the air as well, and depending on the design, this is just an example.
Okay.
But they have units that with the way they're designed, they can even dehumidify the air. They have units that have pre-filters in them to where they can filter the air out for folks, like say they're worried about pollen or molds from outside, before the air ever touches the living spaces or it ever gets connected to the ductwork. If you have ductwork in your home, as an example, it's a great way. It's a great way to help people that are in that specific situation. But we don't blindly tell folks to do this. We really want to dive into what is the particulars of their home, where are the issues, where are they at, and then figure out where does this step, remember we were talking about steps before, fit? Is this step number 1 or is this step number 4 or 5?
Yep, 100%.
And of course it's subjective, but we're trying to be reasonable.
Yeah, no, 100%. And that's what I always say, that you can do things yourself, and it would take you a lot longer, and it probably take you a lot more money than going to an expert. Experts are it's like using a sat nav. They'll cut through all the noise, all the nonsense, and give you the best route there. And that's why I get people like yourself on the show, because I want to talk about this. I want people to be aware of what could be going on, and then go, oh, actually, I've had some mold here, or I've had some condensation going on for a long period of time, or there's a crawl space or an attic that, at certain times of the year, you get a funny smell or maybe a bit of damp coming from it. I want people just to be aware of these things, because that, or the shower room, for example, where especially this time of year when it's cold outside and they get heat and the condensation in the windows, and if they don't wipe that down, or if they don't get something going on where it can actually an extraction or extractor, it can cause issues. So I think it's just, and then if they have got it, or and it's too late, definitely, well, not even too late. Prevention is always better than cure. So going to someone like yourself first is fantastic. If they have got it, go and see someone like yourself to understand what steps need to be done, what needs to be done first. Does UV light, is that a good way of curing mold spores or colonizations?
Sure. Another great question. Here's what I can offer on UV light. There certainly are concerns about its use. Number one, traditionally has been the production of ozone or other potential byproducts, technically called intermediates, that can be created by the use of this purification technology known as UV. The idea of putting a light bulb in a ductwork or somewhere, we don't really recommend that, because there's other concerns with people who have chronic illness. Remember, we're trying to remove variables from the equation. We don't want to add variables to the equation, which could just be a concern by adding UV, because it's a purification device initially. However, here's the however. There are times and situations where, let's say somebody has an air conditioning system and they're in a humid climate, and because their evaporative coil, the part that helps cool the air in the summertime, is working overtime with all this exposure to moisture, there tends to be microbial growth that occurs in this at or around the evaporator coil itself, which is a part of an air conditioning system. And in situations where it's really tough to keep it clean, there are folks that will put an UV light right there and basically try to use it to sanitize or sterilize that area, which inherently I don't have a problem with, because they're trying to see if it will help and see, maybe there's more that needs to be done. The only caveat I would add, if they're going to do that, if someone's listening, they're like, oh, that's a potential great idea. I've been having mold growth or something in my drain pan or on my coil. The one thing I would caution you is make sure that the plastic components or any components that might otherwise be affected by UV are UV resistant. We've seen stories or heard things about people doing that, and then over 2 or 3 years, the drain pan, for example, cracks because it wasn't UV resistant, and now they have a moisture problem because the water's leaking through the crack, and they just created a problem even though they spent all that time and effort trying to prevent one.
Right, so you've got to know. Well, you've got to be careful. You've got to know what you're doing. Oh, sorry, my alarm's just gone off there. So Right. So for people that may have this or want to get their homes tested, what are, first of all, best tests that they can do? People. So yourself, you are you only based in Arizona? Are you around? Can people get to you?
Yeah. No, best. In terms of availability, I work throughout the country, the site visits wise in the States, but in terms of phone or virtual consultations, I do those across, around the globe. I've been in a lot. In fact, if they go to, just to give people information, if they go to environmentalanalytics.net and they go to the main page, there's actually a map and they can actually see where we've worked with clients before around the globe. But I didn't want to interrupt you, is why I hesitated. You're basically asking, is there like a best test or something that we feel is the best indicator?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I don't mind you, because I don't want to get into that anyway. I want to tell people where they can find you because I think it's vital. But it's like, testing, like what tests they can get done, who they should trust with it, and like how much these tests cost. Like, I mean, what's the sort of like the average cost for these tests or things? Because like everything, I'm guessing there's tests that don't cost as much and there's tests that do cost a lot.
Right.
Yeah. So like,
man, I'll tell you what, I think the first disclaimer to that question is as soon as I have a good answer for you, I'll let you know, and a little bit of humor, because I feel like the test that you collect depends on the question you're trying to answer. And I'll give you a 30-second example, then I'll make some thoughts and suggestions. If you're somebody who has a chronic illness and you're laying in a hospital bed and your doctor is worried about a pathogenic exposure, like they're afraid you're going to have aspergillosis grow in your lungs, then the focus is on viable mold. And so in the old traditional model of assessing, people would be collecting petri dish samples or culturing with agar media and seeing what grows, because the growth was the concern. It was, if something doesn't grow, then they weren't as concerned. That the paradigm of what we're in today has changed. It's not that that's not a concern. It's more about focusing on people who have chronic exposure where the viability of the mold isn't the only concern. It can be dead. It can be 10 years old, 20 years old. And if it's a source that's communicating in your living spaces or workspaces, then there's a concern by certain people, medical professionals, certain diagnoses like CIRS, for example, which is a huge one, where the inflammatory response from your innate immune system and you being genetically susceptible is the concern. And in plain English, it doesn't matter whether it's alive or dead in that model. So to answer your question about the best test methods, I don't know that there's a best one, but I will acknowledge that a huge test that's been used is something that the audience probably knows as ERMI, this whole idea of a surface dust sample that they can collect in their home. And I guess I should probably say ERMI stands for Environmental Relative Moldiness Index. But I want to stress some huge issues and concerns for the audience. ERMI, the way most people understand it, which can be a more expensive test, and there are labs that offer kind of a do-it-yourself kit. They range anywhere from, I know I'm talking in the U.S. numbers here, but somewhere between $250 and $300. So whatever the conversion is there. But the problem is that a lot of people think that by collecting these samples that they're going to be able to interpret their total exposure, which is very far from my experience to be the truth. They don't have kits for heart surgeons, right? Like you can't go to your box store and be a heart surgeon by taking a kit and thinking you're an expert. There's so much that goes into the interpretation of these samples that unfortunately some of these labs don't provide. However, one of the reasons I do like qPCR sampling is because it can identify those fragments that I was telling you about earlier. If there's DNA in a mold structure, whether it's a spore or a fragment or a hyphal structure, and it's one of the 36 molds that they're testing for in an ERMI, then it could potentially be picked up. What we don't like, and again, this is just my experience, is we don't like when people use the graph. There's an ERMI graph that was developed through this EPA research in the States that was, commercialized in 2006, where you do an ERMI dust sample, you just look at the score. You wouldn't even really pay attention to any of the molds. You would just look at the score, and then you'd see where you're at on a graph. Well, that has been seemingly proven to not be by itself the best indicator of a problem by simply just looking at the graph. And to just help the audience here in the next couple of minutes better understand it, there's been other people like Dr. Richie Shoemaker, some of you listening may be familiar with that name, who came up with their own criteria using an ERMI dust sample. And Dr. Shoemaker wasn't looking at the graph. He was simply looking at the patients and saying, gee whiz, whenever someone has an ERMI score above 2, even despite treatment, these people weren't giving better. And eventually that evolved to a Hurts Me sample, which was basically the same type of sample, but it was only looking at 5 molds, and it gave you a score. And you can collect these samples. You can order these kits from a couple known labs here in the States, and they'll send them your way, and you can get a sample result. But at the end of the day, it's just it's like anything else that you deal with, Ryan. It's just a tool. It's another bit of evidence. It's not the all-seeing eye. It's not going to predict the future. It's a tool that you can use. And there have been situations, quite frankly, when I do samples using qPCR analysis, which is what ERMI is. I like to refer to it as the analysis method. So I actually look at the individual species.
So for people out there, just quickly, because usually quite a few acronyms there, CRIS, QPRC, what do these stand for?
Oh, sure. Thank you for that. So qPCR is quantitative polymerase chain reaction. I know that's a mouthful, so that's why we call it qPCR. Yeah. And qPCR is just the methodology. If you look under a sample under a microscope, that's called microscopy. This is called qPCR. And it's a very expensive machine that's looking for DNA in samples and it's a more forensic, more detailed analysis. It's also a more expensive analysis, to answer your previous question, so the takeaway from qPCR and this dust sample is that a lot of people out there know that there are these kits, but where they're running into problems is they collect the samples and they don't really know what to do with the result. Just for the record, when I do these samples, I'm looking at a majority of just the species themselves and the physiology of them. I'm saying, okay, does it make sense that this mold is present? If I was to share my screen with you one more time, just to give you a quick sneak peek, I'm looking at outdoor control samples and indoor samples and comparing it. I mean, I'm getting into the numbers is my point. And I don't care what the score is at the bottom, because that doesn't help me. I'm looking at, does it make sense that this house at this residence has these quantities based off of controls and other history of the home? Well, your average person is not going to, your average client is not, who does this doesn't have that information. They're not the professional, which leads me to the second thing. What's the best? Well, for me, the best thing, it has nothing to do with the sample. It's to educate yourself about what your problem is. Work with an IEP. It doesn't have to be me. There are other people out there. In fact, I can give you a couple resources at the end if you're interested, and see if they can guide you to figure out whether or not it even makes sense to do a qPCR dust sample, or maybe it does make sense to do Petri dish sampling. There are other kits out there where people will say, well, I like to do Petri dish, where there's it's basically just a small plate that's got a media in there, a nutrient for mold to grow, and they'll stick it in the home and they'll look for mold to grow. But you can do that and you won't spend, $250, $300 on that analysis, but do you know how to interpret it is the problem. Just because mold grows on a Petri dish doesn't mean you have a problem. Yeah,
I mean, for these things, I'm always like, Wade Lightheart, I don't know if you know who Wade Lightheart is. He's got a company called Bioptimize. It's phenomenal for digestion. And he said something on a show, I was listening to him before I had him on a show, and I brought it up. And he said, look, we can make cheaper supplements, or people can go and buy cheaper supplements, but there's nothing more expensive than a supplement that doesn't work, right? And this is how I feel about the tests. What's the point of getting the cheaper test if it doesn't work? And as you said, I say to my clients all the time, cool, they've tested you for this and they've told you that you've got arthritis. They haven't told you why you've got arthritis. That's the key. So not only do you need to interpret the test and see what you've got, but you need to know what's going on. And that's why it's important, in my opinion, to work with someone, because it cuts through all that.
Well, and let me just use one more easy example for me. Is I've been in a number of cases where the client, is interested in looking at exposure. The clinician is interested in getting results of the home. So there's no argument that the client and the clinician want to have some metric, some test in the home to see where it's at. Meanwhile, there's 4 or 5 areas in the home that have strong or obvious evidence of a microbial source, which begs the question, drum roll, should we take care of that problem or pursue it further before you spend any quantity of money to address exposure? You're going to do all this testing up front, this exposure testing, and then you're still going to need to potentially remediate a problem, and then you're going to go, oh crap, I need to resample again in the future. Well, you could have saved money and spent that towards more useful action items to help get your home better, truly trying to put the client's needs here. This just emphasizes the need to work with professionals when you can, to try and prioritize what's the next step for you.
100%. I'm always saying, so you got a heart problem. They go, oh, you've got a heart problem. Cool, I'm going to cut myself open and try and play around with my heart myself. No, you go to a heart surgeon. It's just one of those, because you want to, it's true. Like, I always say to people, it's just, from my experience, it's been so much, otherwise you're playing around with things you don't know, you're not professional in it. What I said to people, would you go and try and fix your car if you didn't have a clue about how to do it? You go to a mechanic, or you try and cut your own hair. I know you go to a hairdresser. It's just one of those things. And so I 100% agree. And with these things, is all mold and all funguses that you find, are they all able to be removed, or are some properties too far gone? And when it comes to those things that you mentioned there, are you going to do that here, or are you going to go to the root of it? What sort of costs, and do people have to move out of the house?
Yeah, the question, I think, was, can you remove all of it? And tricky question. Happy to entertain it. So when we talk about remove, I think the first question is what?
Sorry, yeah. When I meant that as well, Michael. Sorry, I don't mean, because I know it's gonna be there. I mean, at least bring it within livable standards. Do you know? Yeah.
Oh, well, okay, so maybe the question then, if it was said, can you return it to a pre-loss state, like a pre-exposure state? Yeah, I think you can. It still, again, it boils down to how much money and what is the metric that defines pre-loss. If someone goes out there and says, well, the metric is a qPCR sample, well, then that's your metric. Well, if the metric is a mycotoxin dust sample, well, then that's your metric. If the metric is spore trap sampling in the air, not that we're necessarily proposing any of these options, just to be clear, then that's your metric. And that, to me, is inherently biased. It's helpful for an IEP or a professional to give guidance, but the true metric of success is not the testing; it's the patient recovering. And so, if the person is in their home, they've had a water intrusion, and they ask the question, Mike, should I remediate it? Is it worth it? Well, worth it is up to you. Is spending 5,000 pounds to remediate something and clean the home up using specific recommendations that don't necessarily even cost an arm and a leg. I know that there are other situations that do cost quite a bit. Is it worth it for you? Well, yeah, it's worth it for me because I'm a millionaire. But there are other people where it may not be worth it because they only have 2,000 pounds to spend, and this remediation project alone is only going to cost 5,000. It's a very good question. It's just so difficult to answer because it depends on the target we're looking at.
Yeah, I've got to ask them, even though there's not a definitive answer. It's always, I just need to ask them so people can understand. Like,
you need to ask the question, and they deserve to hear the question and where we're at in the answer. I mean, anybody. Let me say it this way. Anybody that offers you a guarantee is inherently not putting your needs first, because how can they possibly know that whatever they do to your home, remedial, cleaning, is going to make it good enough for you? Are they a DNA whisperer? Can they talk to your body and figure it out? Obviously, it's a rhetorical question. They can't. So that's a little bit discouraging, right? I mean, the audience understands, okay, yeah, you got a good point, Mike. You want to be careful if someone's offering guarantees. How can they really do that, for me to get better? I think the sobering part of it is that this is just a reminder of the theme of many topics we've covered today, which is that this is new frontier. We are learning. We are acquiring. This is not something we've known for hundreds of years. This is something that we're just figuring out. Oh, crap. This is a big issue. Oh, you know what? We've lived our life. I mean, a lot of things were all acute. I broke my arm. I need to fix it. I have a heart attack. I need to address that. Those were more acute problems that people can look at, point at, and go, okay, yep, that's a problem. Then we woke up one day as a species and said, you know what? Why am I feeling this way? Or why is it all of a sudden that somebody 20, 30 years later, after living in a moldy basement, had some issue when there was no other precursor? There was no family history of the problem, but all of a sudden this person is special. And all of a sudden our species woke up and said, you know what? We've been living under the model, and of course not, this is my opinion, we just have to worry about big things like not getting hit by a bus or avoiding a heart attack. And what we're looking at today is chronic low-dose, long-term exposures, which are very hard to quantify, especially in a home that's a moving target. # work with a professional and have them guide you through this complicated process.
I mean, as the ancient Chinese proverb says, dripping in water eventually eats through stone. And so if you have chronic low-end exposure for that period of time, it's I always say to people, oh, yeah, but how comes they've got this and I'm 60 years old and I haven't got anything? Cool. You might when you're 61. You know, like
Well,
I'm not trying to be doomsman.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to say
No,
this is why you need to take these things into consideration, because everyone was healthy once until they weren't. And so this is why I always think it's important to tell people this, because people sit there living, I haven't got a problem yet.
Well, and their takeaway was that some people look at it linear. They think that, this person's, this age and they have it, but I don't. So what does that mean? And trust me when I say I get it. Like, I'd love for our lives to be more linear in terms of understanding and interpreting what's going on. But what we are finding is that not only is it not necessarily as linear, it's just very hard to define because of the soup that you mentioned earlier, Ryan. You're not just looking at mold even, you're looking at potential EMF exposure and chemical exposure and maybe underlying diet issues. And how does that all synergistically work for and against you in your road to recovery?
100%. And because you mentioned it, you said it's like futuristic and it's sort of like the way things are going. More testing stuff. I wanted to ask you, like, segue onto it. Anything you've been working with recently, like you've found that's made your diagnosis easier or better, or anything you stumbled across that's been a bit of a game changer for you in terms of that?
From a field testing or assessment approach, certainly there's some core, a flashlight and a pair of eyes is always going to be important. A client interview is also huge. But to your question on testing, we're still looking at it. We are looking at some new stuff. The testing of bacteria, gram positive, gram negative, just to see whether or not we can use it in the field to help us environmentally identify a source in the home that might otherwise be missed with, say, for example, traditional mold sampling or even the qPCR sampling. We're looking at different ways of capturing the samples, not just dust. Dust gives us history, but there's pros and cons to every type of testing, including dust sampling. And so, can we collect stuff in the air? And if we do that, how can we interpret it? The latest and greatest with the testing is just that. It's more of a work in process. The other thing that we're working on, which has nothing to do with that question, but has to do with the educational component, is I'm excited to say that I'm in the works with a colleague of mine and a university. I can't tell the name right this moment, but a well-known university in developing a program to help train people to become IEPs like myself and like our colleagues who understand it. Because that's the other issue that your audience members are likely thinking is that's all well and good, but the supply is low and the demand is high, and we need more folks out there to help us get through all of this. So we're working on it. We understand, we hear you, and we're wanting to try to get that answered.
No, 100%. Yeah, it's one of those things. I think it's going to be, you guys are in a very growing industry. Same as I mentioned before with Brian and the EMF stuff. I think it's something that people are going to, it's almost in its infancy now, and it's going to continue to get bigger because of the more issues we have. But awesome.
Sure.
So what, last thing, because I know I've kept you for a little while here, Michael. Last thing, anything that you would like to say to sort of wrap up, like anything you say to people?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we did such a really good job at doing today is actually touching on a lot of those points. The biggest thing that has helped me work with patients and what I've learned is, first of all, to be able to slow down and appreciate where people are coming from. And if you can't be empathetic, you can at least be sympathetic and listen to where they're coming from, because I think it's kind of like the first stage is admitting you have a problem. When you're working with people, it's important. This might not just be for, of course, the patients, but certainly for any professionals listening. It's really important to understand that just because you might not understand why somebody is feeling a certain way, you understand that this is what they're claiming and this is what you have to work with, and how can you find a way to address it with science and reasonable rationale. The other thing, which is obviously huge and insinuated by that first point, is that they work with somebody. Most people that reach out to me, it's usually not their first call. Hopefully I'm their last call, but historically they've worked with 2, 3, 4 clinicians, 2, 3, 4 inspectors, and there's so much minutia of data that's either conflicting or it's not answering the same question, but someone's arguing it is, that they are lost. It's that person floating in the ocean trying to figure out what to do. And so if you can work with a professional and you have resources to visit, you have the International Society of Environmentally Acquired Illness.org or IC.org, ICI, the letters ISEAI.org, not to be confusing. You have survivingmold.com. You have you have resources, and I'm sure there are others, and Ryan can certainly mention those if and as needed, where people can go to and try and find professionals. They don't have to necessarily be boots on the ground. They don't have to. I'd like them to be local, but if you're one of those people that live in the middle of nowhere, that's been one of your challenges, hasn't it? That you haven't been able to drive or have somebody come out to your place. You still have people like me who can talk to you and guide you. And there are certain things that these people can do on their own. I'm not necessarily going to have somebody who's highly susceptible do mold remediation in their home, but there's other aspects of the job that they can do in the process that they can manage. And by the way, do it for a fraction of the traditional cost. Work with a professional. And the last thing I can tell you is, if I can offer a suggestion on success, because that's always asked, how do I know it's enough? Will it be safe enough? These things. What I have learned to be the most responsible answer to that is to work with your clinician. Have a baseline on where you're at today. Whatever action you do, it's remediation, it's cleaning, it's some improvement to the home or perceived improvement to the home. Then retrack using the same metric. So if your clinician is using urine, if you're as an analysis or as a metric, if they're using neuroquant, if they're using blood markers, if they're using cluster of symptoms, I'm not a doctor, so I'm not qualified to tell you what that metric is. It's whatever it is, and you agree with it, track that again in another month or 2 or 3 and look for progress, because chronic illness is not something that you can turn on and off and provide a solution to overnight. It's not a light switch. It takes usually months. The model that I'm used to seeing is anywhere from 9 to 18 months that people get from the road of a known exposure and illness to recovery, and it may be longer depending. But the point is if you can use that as a metric, then that will make you feel good and give you some sense of where you're at in that ocean. When it's really dark, you have no clue of whether or not what you did is really helping you or not. And the reason I'm telling you that is because the road to recovery looks like a roller coaster ride. You may trend better, but you're going to have the bad days. And on the days that you have a bad day, I don't want you to be laying on your pillow going, oh man, I should have done this or I should have done that. This is why it's important to work with your clinician and have them track your progress so that you can have numerical evidence that you're heading in the right direction.
Awesome, my man. Thank you for that, Michael. I think you've covered so much there, and I think it's really important for people to understand that. At the end of the day, there's no point in just taking a stab in the dark. You might as well work with someone who knows what they're doing and cut through all the nonsense. And it's we've covered a lot there. So thanks for coming on the show. And just people out there, you said environmentalanalytics.net. Are you on Facebook or Instagram at all?
Facebook, yes. You can type in environmental analytics on there and you'll find me. Thanks for asking. And also, as another thing too, for free information, IEPradio.com. IEP, Indoor Environmental Professional, but the actual website is IEPradio, one word, .com. And the only reason I plug that real quick is because it's free information. Some of you folks out there is like, that's all well and good, guys, but we don't have a dime to use. Is there anywhere information where we can learn some of these fundamentals, whether it's topics on chronic illness, topics on EMF, topics on mold remediation? All that information and more is on that site, free and available for you to listen to.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Michael. The listeners will definitely appreciate that. Thanks for coming on, my man. It's been great. I definitely get you. When I'm sure things will, as you said, you've got some new tests, etc. going on. When that happens, and the university you've been working for, I'll give you a shout and maybe you can let people know what's going on.
Oh, we'll be looking forward to that. And thank you, Ryan, for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
So there you have it, guys and girls. Michael Schrantz from environmentalanalytics.com, and also you can find him at IEPradio.com, where he's got he's got his own podcast, and he'll be talking all about the issues that we raised here. And this goes to show how important it is to lead a healthy lifestyle so we can boost our immune systems or get our immune system as high as possible or strong as possible, build a strong constitution so these things don't affect us, or at least they don't make as big an impact. But he has got great information there. And as Michael said, he does do remote consultations. So if you have got an issue and you want to look at your home or get it inspected, he can help there. And that's at environmentalanalytics.com. And there will be links to their websites in the show notes, which is fantastic. And we'll be getting him back on the show because I'm sure this area will continue to develop and expand and grow, and the technology will get better. So it's something we'll definitely be looking into in the future. I'll get Michael back on. So that's it for this week's show. As always, guys, if you're heading over to www.reviveyourself.co, we've got our shop there, which is full of products, right, what I recommend, things that I use. I wouldn't recommend anything I wouldn't use myself. All come, top quality, all organic. A lot of them are wild crafted and fermented, non-toxic, world-class products for you. If you want meal replacements or protein powder or sun cream or toothpaste or soap or whatever it is from Evolution Organics, we've got Finchley Clinic there and Ancient Purity, very, very powerful. Also got Aquaterra, whole house water filtration systems. I always say to people ask me what the best filters, like Brita filter or Carafe, and I say, look, at the end of the day, if you want to play that game, you should really get your house filtered, the whole house filtration system, because it's not just the water you're using in, that you're showering in or you're drinking, but you're also cleaning your teeth in it, you're cooking your food in it, you're washing your clothes in it. So it's really, really important to have clean water throughout the house. And Aquaterra there, it's got fantastic systems from Graham Brenner. He's a rocket scientist, and he takes out 99.9% of all the nasties you get in your water. And we've got options for 1, 2, 3 or 4 bedroom houses, and hard and soft water depending where you live. Also got our link to the Ancient Purity to Essential Oil Wizardry. If you haven't listened to my episode with Dr. Nick Berry, I'd suggest you go back and do that. I've got 2 episodes of him. The last one was episode 145, and he's talking about so many different issues and how essential oils can help them. And if you put in the code REVIVE there, you're going to get 10% off on all of his products, but using our code. So that's REVIVE10. And blueblocks.com. If you're looking for blue blocking glasses, I wear mine every night as soon as the sun goes down, from Andy Manf. And if you go to www.blueblocks, that's BLUBLOX.com, you'll get 10% off with the code REVIVE there as well. It's something that I highly suggest, especially we've got far too much exposure from blue light, especially at night, and it's leading to all manner of health issues. So the best in the business, in my opinion. Blue Blocks, definitely the best styles, which is fantastic. And all these things add up. It's not just nutrition, it's also the light, the water you're drinking, how much stress you're getting exposed to. One of the things that's why I always talk about turning Wi-Fi off at night. It's hugely important if you want your body to detoxify the glymphatic and lymphatic systems. So it's really, really powerful. As always, if you have been dealing with a chronic health issue or disease and you haven't been able to get to the bottom of it or overcome it, and you're looking for someone to help you, then please do send me an email at ryan@reviveyourself.co, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible, and we can have a chat about how we can help you. If you are looking for someone, though, you can always go to our website, as mentioned before, www.reviveyourself.co, and you can click on our testimonials just to see the people we've helped with all manner of issues. I know some people like to just read stories, so we've got our testimonials there. But yeah, send me an email, ryan@reviveyourself.co, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible, and we can discuss how we can get you over your issues and living a life full of health and vitality again. That's it for this week, guys. I'll see you next week, and as always, stay happy, stay healthy. Speak to you soon. Bye-bye.
If you're struggling with gut issues, such as gas, bloating, constipation, diarrhea, indigestion, heartburn, and want to finally be able to eat the foods you love without the crippling after effects, then don't forget to head over to reviveyourself.co and pick up your free copy of The Healing Health Paradigm today.